afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Social Hour, which is our webcast for today with the theme being preparing for your first SOC 1 examination. We're happy that you are all with us, hopefully to learn a little bit today, but also we understand that we are approaching the end of the year and it is a race for CPE. So whatever reason you're on, we appreciate you being here with us today. So I'm Karen Cardillo. I am a director in our National SOC and High Trust practice out of the Raleigh, North Carolina office. I have been working in SOC reporting for about 15 years now, previously with another firm and now with Forbes Mazars for about 3 years. And I am presenting today with Ryan Boggs, so I will turn it over to him to get us kicked off.
Yeah, good afternoon, Ryan Boggs. I'm principal in our National SOC and High Trust practice. Been with the firm about 16 years. Started as a financial auditor and then kind of migrated into the SOC and High Trust space. So really excited for today's conversation. I think it's a good time of year to be talking about SOC 1 examinations as well as how to prepare for your first examination. And again, as Karen said, if you're not here to maybe pursue a SOC 1 examination yourself, and maybe you're a user of SOC 1 reports, we'll talk about that as well. And if you've never heard of a SOC 1 report, our hope is that you walk away with a good understanding in case you run into those reports in the future. So definitely encourage questions. You'll see a Q&A section in your webinar or webinar section or your platform here. So if you have questions at any point, please drop a note. If we don't get to all questions before the end of the webinar, we'll definitely follow up with you and definitely encourage an open dialogue in today's session. So you can see our agenda for today. We've got our introductions knocked out. So we're going to talk about just some basics around SOC reporting, just set the tone for the conversation today. Make sure that as we throw some acronyms at you, you understand what we're talking about and how we can set up for a successful SOC 1 examination. And then we're going to kind of walk through the steps, kind of step by step, from really initiation through reporting of what a successful SOC 1 examination looks like. And then we'll close out with questions and kind of some tips and tricks to prevent any hurdles in the future. So before we start the conversation today, we want to maybe have a quick poll so you can see that pop up today. You are obviously eligible for CPE today, so we'll have 4 polling questions, so make sure you look out for those. Obviously, as Karen said, we know this is a CPE season right now, so really just trying to take a poll for understanding who our audience is and kind of are you guys negotiating with a potential client for a SOC 1 examination, or are you kind of looking to learn more about a SOC 1, or hey, you're just here for CPE and you want to learn more about SOC 1 reports in general. So appreciate your input there, and we'll get the conversation kicked off here in a second. I know, Karen, SOC 1 reporting is your favorite type of report, so looking forward to today's conversation. All right, fantastic. Well, thank you for your participation. Great results here. Obviously, kind of leading the pack here, neither negotiating or acquiring SOC 1. So hey, for those that are here that are pursuing a SOC 1, definitely encourage you to ask questions. Make sure you walk away with a clear understanding. And those that are here for CPE, hang on for a good conversation. Should be a good discussion here. So we're going to start off with some SOC basics. Really probably want to start off, what does SOC even mean, right? So if you've not seen that acronym before, System and Organization Controls Reporting, SOC, you may have heard this called a number of different things in the past. We're going to talk about that in a second. So we're going to throw some acronyms at you. So just hang tight. I will try to define those and make sure we're not using alphabet soup in our conversation. But ultimately, the reason we are in this business is there are a lot of third parties that we're relying on. And we saw that really take off probably going into COVID and coming out of COVID. We've seen just really an increase in third-party reliance. And when we think about third-party reliance, that could be anything that we as an organization are outsourcing to a vendor. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, if we're outsourcing a service to a vendor, how do we get comfortable that a vendor is performing that function as we expect as a customer? How do we know that they're securing their data, processing that transaction completely, accurately, timely, and performing their SLAs, their service level agreements to our expectations? And so SOC reporting is really, has come through historically through that lens. And we've now seen that's really a vehicle to gain that level of assurance on those third-party controls. And I'd say the diagram here in the bottom, our users of SOC reports, I think that's a good indication of kind of setting the tone, right? So if you're a CPA in today's conversation, you're probably using SOC reports in some form or fashion. If you're an auditor, you're performing an audit, you're relying on a third party for some type of transactional data, and you're gaining a SOC report or obtaining it, gaining that level of assurance in your audit. And so if we think about it in that lens, almost every audit firm out there is using a SOC report in their financial audit to place assurance on a third party. And so that's a big use of SOC 1 reports. And then we kind of turn our attention for our users and user entities. And really that is, the organization issuing the report itself. So they are dealing with maybe multiple requests, for a report of some form or fashion, right? And so for a user, we want to actually obtain that level of assurance and actually gain that assurance from our vendors. And so as a user entity, we are using the SOC report to our advantage. And then the service organization is that organization that's issuing the report. So that is essentially organizations that are performing some type of transactional oversight, processing, et cetera, and they actually need to issue that report out to a user entity for that level of assurance. So hopefully that sets the stage for our conversation. It gives you a sense of the use of the SOC report out there. Some more definitions. We'll kind of go through this pretty quickly, but just talk about service organization or service provider. Again, that is the organization that's issuing that report to provide that level of assurance. And one area we wanted to spend a minute on, just talking about sub-service organizations. Karen's going to go through a couple of conversations about this and want to make sure you understand what exactly a sub-service organization is. And so if I'm issuing a SOC 1 report and I use a third party, such as Azure, AWS, Google, then I have a sub-service organization that I'm using to host my systems, host my data. And so I want to disclose that use of that third party in my report. And so that is really the definition of a vendor that is used as part of the control environment. And so we need to disclose that use so that the user organization or user entity can understand that I'm processing a transaction or I'm performing a service, but as part of that service, I'm outsourcing some component of my control environment to a sub-service organization. So hopefully that kind of clears that up, and you'll hear that term referred to multiple times throughout today's conversation. Service auditor, that is your traditional audit firm, CPA firm that's issuing the report. And so that is the Forbes Mazars of the world. So we're out there issuing reports on a weekly basis for our clients. And we're typically issuing a SOC 1 report to user auditors. And I think this is an important component of SOC 1 reporting, is that SOC 1 reports are typically an auditor to auditor communication. So because SOC 1 is designed to report on internal controls over financial reporting, or ICFR, we typically design that SOC 1 report so that a financial auditor can obtain that report, look at that and say, okay, I understand that Forbes Mazars audited these controls as an independent auditor and tested them and essentially provided an opinion that I can place reliance on and not go audit that service organization myself. And so that is a way for efficiencies to be gained in the financial audit space. And this time of year, you're probably actively pursuing, obtaining those SOC 1 reports so that your auditors can place reliance on those. Another just term we'll talk about this in more detail, is the control activity. Controls, this is what we're reporting on, right? So system and organization controls reports. We are controls auditors, and I'd say that's a big part of our conversation today. Is we're not typically doing any kind of substantive testing around a financial statement, right? We're doing controls-based testing to gain a level of confidence in that control's effectiveness, so we can issue our opinion on that control environment. All right, so we talked about some terms and some, overarching kind of themes of SOC reporting, but not to confuse you more here, but we have SOC 1, SOC 2, and SOC 3. Obviously, our conversation is directly tied to SOC 1 reporting today, but if you've never interacted with SOC reports in the past, just be aware that SOC 2 is probably the most prevalent report we issue as an audit firm, but that doesn't mean SOC 1 is not as important. But I would say SOC 2 is placed, it's come out of the overarching need to issue reports on third parties and focused on the IT component of that. So you can see in the middle of that paragraph, you can see that we have security, availability, processing integrity, and then if you look down, confidentiality and privacy, there's 5 different categories that you can essentially attest to, and that is really IT focused. You can hear those terms and understand SOC 2 is very much IT versus SOC 1 is internal controls over financial reporting, really to help a financial auditor place assurance on that control environment. All right, so let's get into the conversation today. And again, we're going to kind of talk through, from very beginning of, hey, I've got a request to issue a SOC report. What do I do? How do I approach this? What are my next steps? And so again, if you got questions or if you have an experience in this space, we would appreciate you dropping us a line in the Q&A function of the webinar. And so I'll just kind of talk through the historical nature of SOC reporting. You probably have, if you've been in the profession long enough, you remember we used to call this SAS 70, then it was SSAE 16, now it's 18, and 21 is our new standard. And essentially those are all just our examination standards that are outlined by the AICPA that allow the CPA firm to issue the report. And so don't probably confuse yourself with those terms, right? But if you have a contract that outlines that your organization must go through a SSAE report of some form or fashion, maybe it says SOC 1 type 2 or SOC 1 type 1 or whatever that might be, that's going to be your first indication of, okay, this is what we're talking about, right? It's going to be issued under this standard, and you're going to need to talk through, okay, what controls are we going to report on? How are we going to pursue this? And really that should be your initial jumping off point. And I would say most of our clients are contractually bound to issue this report. I don't know many clients out there that have just said, let's go out and issue a SOC report just to gain some market share. It's typically contractual obligations responding to customer demands, and therefore you issue that report. And then the hope is that you use that to gain market share as an ROI from there. So let's talk about kind of what is covered. So the request came in, we need to issue a SOC report, we need to issue a SOC 1 report. I think the big question we get a lot is, okay, I need to issue a SOC 1 report. What is that? What's it covered? Who am I going to send it to? Is it a certification? Is it an examination? Is it an opinion? And so let's just kind of talk through that. And again, if you have questions, feel free to drop us a line here. But ultimately, as I mentioned, what we're trying to really attest to is your controls that impact the financial statements of your customers. And so when we talk to clients that are starting this journey, sometimes we'll get into a conversation and we're trying to audit every component of the environment. And ultimately, we want to pull that back a little bit and say, at the end of the day, the SOC 1 report should be scoped to controls that impact your customers. And so we're not going to typically test your internal controls that impact your financials. but we're going to try to pivot that conversation and look at controls that you may own, you may operate, that ultimately would have a downstream effect to your your customer's financial statements. And so if you're thinking about this from a user perspective, right, if I receive a SOC report from a vendor, typically we've seen that kind of trace that back to the financial statements, right? So if something is hitting a financial statement line item, that the vendor is entering in that data, right? Maybe they're providing some type of report, some type of transactional detail, and that's hitting the financial statements in some form or fashion. That typically would require a SOC report, SOC 1 report, because now our vendor is impacting our financial statements. And that typically is our trigger, right? That's our threshold to get over. It doesn't have to be that level of granularity, but ultimately you want to issue a SOC 1 report when you have a material impact to your customer's financials. And ultimately your customer is going to decide the materiality threshold, right? So you may not believe it's material, but your customer may believe that you have a material impact, and so that they're going to require that report. So we'll talk about the report contents in more detail, but ultimately this report is not a one-page certification, right? We're not issuing SOC 1 certifications. There is no such thing as a SOC certification. So just from a language perspective, we're issuing an examination, or we're attesting to controls or control environment. And in particular, we're attesting to management's assertion and the system description, the control objectives, and those controls that make up that report. So we'll talk about that in more detail. But at the end of the day, if you get that contract and it says SOC 1, start to think about from a financial reporting perspective, and that should give you some indication of scoping to get that scope right. All right, so we talked about this a little bit, but ultimately, a lot of our clients, maybe there's some hesitation, right, to jump off and go down this path. And while typically that contract is the driver, right, that really pushes the organization to pursue a SOC report, there is some ROI that you want to try to obtain post issuance of the report, right? So, you're issuing a report on your controls. Obviously, the hope is that that opinion is a good opinion, unqualified, and you've got the right controls in place to represent your control environment. So you can imagine that report is very detailed, and it's going to really demonstrate your commitment to excellence in controls. And so you want to make sure that that report is thorough enough so that an end user or user entity can pick up that report, read that description, look at the controls, and walk away with a clear indication of this organization, has invested in a control environment that protects my data, that processes my data accurately, completely, timely, and here are the results that represent that commitment to excellence. And so we do see that clients use this report. If you issue it for one customer, ultimately you're probably going to start to open this report up to multiple customers to demonstrate your commitment to controls and maintaining an effective control environment. Obviously, it's not an IT report, right? So if you're an IT organization and you're trying to demonstrate, security or data privacy, SOC 2 is the conversation there. But if you're talking about impacting your customers' financials, the SOC 1 is going to be the opportunity to do that. All right, so let's talk about kind of the blocking and tackling of a SOC report, some foundational components, right? And I think the big takeaway out of this entire slide, a lot of language on this slide, I'd probably draw your attention to the diagram here, the control objectives, the control activities, the testing procedures. Ultimately, the controls that we test as auditors in a SOC 1 are your controls. And so we do like to come to the conversation with some baseline control objectives and some control activities, but ultimately it's the client's responsibility to define those controls and to tailor them to the organization. And that takes some time, right? It's not an overnight process. There's going to be some back and forth, and typically there's walkthroughs or conversations that occur to gain that level of clarity about what that control objective should be and what that control activity should be as well. So let's talk about what exactly is an objective. So think about it as that's the overarching statement around a control area that we're trying to define. And typically it's around a certain component of your environment. So, if you're processing a transaction and maybe there's a receivable component or a payable component or a reporting component, you'd have objectives that define each of those so that we're not trying to test everything as one environment or one, component of the, so we want to try to segment the control objectives into manageable, areas that we can then pull in actual control activities or what you do as an organization within those control objectives. So, typically we're seeing a SOC 1 report with 10 to 15 control objectives, and then you'd have underlying controls within those. And so those controls support the objective. And that could be, it could be logical access, it could be reconciliations, it could be input of data or reporting of data. And so there are multiple types of control activities that you can define that ultimately need to support the objective. And you'll see in most SOC 1 reports that the objective has some language in it around, processing a transaction completely, accurately, timely. And so those are some of the components of the objective that activity needs to support. And so we need to have a control that talks about what does the organization do to perform a reconciliation to evaluate completeness or to evaluate accuracy. Or if we're doing, if we're reporting out to something to an end user, what is that organization doing to ensure that report goes out timely? And so those components of the objective must tie to those controls. And so that is really the connection point there. And at the end of the day, the auditor will come in and they will design test those testing procedures to audit that control activity to support the objective. And so it can sound very complex, convoluted. At the end of the day, right, we're trying to make sure that we build some building blocks that ultimately present the control environment in a very succinct way, starting with the objective, with the control activities, and the testing procedures. All right, and so just to kind of talk through the types of SOC reports that we have, ultimately, you're going to probably see 9 times out of 10 that your customer wants to obtain a SOC 1 Type 2 examination. And there's probably one major reason for that is that the financial auditor that is going to obtain that report is performing a financial audit, right? Over a fiscal year is 12 months. And so we want the longest examination period possible. All right, so that's really the driver of a Type 2 examination. A Type 1 is an as-of date report, and it is a great starting point. It is an opportunity to get a report to market, but it's not going to probably give that auditor as much assurance as they want because it is only assessing design and implementation of the control as of a certain date. So as of December 10th, 2024, the control was designed and implemented. Versus if we issue a SOC 1 Type 2 examination, we're going to assess controls over an examination period, can be anywhere from 3 to 12 months. I'd say 6 months is probably a bare minimum on a SOC 1, right, to provide as much assurance as possible. It can go as short as 3 and as long as 12. But you can see that a SOC 1 Type 2 examination from January 1 of 24 to December 31st of 2024, over a 12-month period, assessing design, implementation, and operating effectiveness, gives me as an auditor a lot more assurance on those controls. And so that is really what you're typically going to see as a driver of that. And so don't be surprised, right, if you get that contract and it says you got to issue a SOC 1 report, that the audit firm you talk to says, okay, guys, we can issue a type 1, but ultimately the goal should be a type 2, and we should align that report with the customer's fiscal year. So right now, we're issuing a lot of SOC reports, especially SOC 1 reports, to support a financial statement audit for a 12/31 year end. And so we're issuing those reports so the auditor can take that report, place reliance on it, and perform their financial audit. All right, so next up, we have a polling question here. And the question is, has your organization received a request from a prospect or existing client for a certain type of SOC 1 report? And I should have mentioned that Karen and I always have a competition on who can get the most questions, and I'm losing big time right now.
That's good. That's good. The AICPA always likes to confuse us with the SOC 1, SOC 2, Type 1, Type 2. So just looking at this question, but so you're all experts, I feel like, at this point with the terminology for SOC reporting, which will set you up nicely for the next section that we'll kick off here in just a minute.
All right, well, appreciate your response. So this is our second polling question, so we'll keep going, but appreciate everybody's input on this question. So I'm going to turn it over to Karen to talk to us about the roadmap for a successful SOC 1 examination.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. I really appreciate it. So yeah, I mean, you know, there's a lot that goes into the SOC 1 examination and really being successful. So we'll just start kind of with the first part, you know, setting expectations, right? And this isn't just for SOC, right? Every time you go into some sort of audit, every time you go into some sort of task, or, you know, you've got to set your expectations. And there's no difference with a SOC report. And really the main thing I think here is, you know, getting people to understand the importance of getting it right? Getting people to buy in, really understanding what the SOC 1 process is going to take. Ultimately, you know, this is not a self-assessment. When you get to that examination, it is something, you know, that has to be performed by an independent CPA firm. But I will say, if you prepare yourself, I always think about the examination as kind of an open book test at the end, right? If you're preparing yourself throughout, and we'll talk through those steps, it's teaching you, you know, the ins and outs of what are going to be on the test. It's showing you where the answers, that is setting you up for success, so that when it does come time to for the examination, you already know what's going to be on there. You may not know if the equation is, you know, 1 + 1 = 2 or 1 + 2 = 3. You may not know the exact equation, but we've set you up for, you know, this is what's going to be on the test. So really setting the expectations at the beginning and getting that buy-in is going to be really important to kick off the process. So the next couple of slides, what we'll do is kind of go through the individual milestones, and we've broken those down by kind of a timeline from start to finish. So before we jump directly into the timeline, you know, the most important thing to do, you know, again, even before you start thinking about where I start, the starting point is the project scope, right? You really want to understand, like Ryan said, first of all, are we getting a SOC 1 or are we getting a SOC 2? So for the purpose of this presentation, we are talking about a SOC 1. And then are you getting a Type 1 or are you getting a Type 2? So really understanding the level of effort, what your clients are expecting from a project scoping standpoint. And then also when you're thinking about the scope of the engagement, it's not just, you know, what the processes are that we want to include. Like Ryan mentioned earlier, what are our clients ultimately going to want to see in the report? what controls are impacting those customers. So it's not really just thinking through those processes, but it's also thinking about the systems that are backing those processes, right? So from an IT general controls perspective, what systems should be in scope? You also want to think about what reports. From a SOC 1 perspective, there's always a lot of controls around inputs and outputs of reports, but what are the critical and key reports that your clients want to see, right? You could go into a SOC 1 and say, I want to cover all reports. And then you get in there and you say, that is really not feasible. So what do my clients care about from a reporting perspective? So one of the most important things is truly understanding the scope, getting the right people involved before you even, start with your timeline. And so what we have on the screen is kind of a generic timeline, right? We have clients that can get through this entire process in a significantly shorter amount of time. I have a client right now who's got 150 SOC 1 controls, 700 requests. It is going to take them significantly longer because of the complexity of their environment. So this is just, again, high level general timeline. This does not fit, everybody, but we'll go through these still as kind of phases. So we'll start, with that phase 1. So month 1, month 2, planning and scoping. So we talked a little bit about what that would include, but one of the other key pieces is making sure that you're engaging the right stakeholders in, these conversations. So, one of the biggest pitfalls I see is when you've got, a project manager who is trying to take on this entire process by themselves, right? They may have a lot of high level knowledge about individual processes, but they don't know the ins and the outs and the daily tasks that are being done. So making sure that you're understanding, here are all the different teams and subject matter experts that we want to get involved so that they have buy-in on the controls and kind of what we're going to test. I do love the idea, though, of appointing that project leader. I think that makes the entire process much smoother, right? Having somebody who can wrangle in what we need, having someone who can kind of, make sure that we're on track with the timeline that we set at the beginning. So I do think that's always a very positive thing to have. So we talked through a little bit about determining that audit scope, but I do love one of the items on here about developing data flows and process flows. So one of the first things I feel like when you go into a SOC 1 is talk to me about the data and how it's flowing through systems and what you're doing to help ensure completeness and accuracy, right? So drawing, almost like a data flow diagram is really helpful up front to kind of map out where that information is and where we feel like we should have controls. A really great exercise to kick off that planning and scoping piece. Once you feel like you have really nailed down what our scope is going to be, we know the systems, we know the processes, we feel good about that. The next piece is really identifying the controls that we want to test and making sure we have the appropriate documentation to do so. So like we talked about with the SOC 1, you're going to have those process-based financial reporting controls. So making sure, we have data integrity controls. We're processing transactions completely and accurately. Do we do recons? Do we have edit checks? Those types of things from a process control. And then also defining those IT general controls. So again, that could include your logical access, change management, backups, that sort of thing. So making sure you're covering both. I know a lot of times we go into these planning meetings with new clients who don't think about the IT side of things. They feel like, hey, I'm not getting a SOC 2, so we don't need to cover IT GCs. But when you ultimately start thinking about the risks and where the information lies, you start to realize that those are important as well. One of the best ways I feel like in defining controls is really thinking about what could go wrong, right? Because ultimately we are trying to mitigate risk with control. So thinking about it from the reverse side of, well, if I don't do this recon, what could go wrong? Or if I don't have these edit checks in the system, what could go wrong, right? Maybe I'm putting in numbers way larger because there's no edit check on the size of the number, right? Or significantly smaller. But thinking about it from the reverse side, the oh crap side is what I like to call it. Like, what could actually happen if we don't have these controls is always a great way to make sure you're kind of covering the important risks as you're defining these controls. Absolutely consider both preventative and detective controls. It's great if you have a control that prevents something from happening, but we're not all perfect and we're not always going to prevent everything from happening, especially when you're introducing manual controls into the environment. So having a detective control in each of those control objectives is a really great way to help mitigate risk and make sure that you're covered if something does go wrong. Are we going to catch it? So think about that from both sides as well when you're defining your controls. And then ultimately documenting your controls, having formal policies is also a great way to make sure that you're capturing everything. So almost like an internal walkthrough and walking through the process start to finish, documenting it in that policy or procedure. Here's what we do, here's what we should do. And then having somebody else take a look through that, right? If you have somebody else take a look through that, it's easier for them to say, hey, I don't know how you're mitigating this, or I don't know how you're performing this. I think having that second set of eyes is also really important. So documenting, the processes, have someone else take a third-party look through that to make sure we feel like we're truly covered from a control identification standpoint. Just continuing through this, it does talk a little bit about types of controls and control objectives you might see in a type 1. But what I say, or a SOC 1, but what I say about a SOC 1 is, depending on the, organization you're in, this objectives, they could cover so many different things, right? We do SOC 1s over financial institutions. We do them over logistics companies. We do them over IT companies. We do them over a variety of different types of companies. So, this is just a high level, these could be included in your SOC 1, but ultimately going back to what Ryan said, thinking about the controls that impact your customers will help drive what those control objectives would be. So just a couple more tips on, developing your controls, like we mentioned, is really developing those policies and procedures. That's the key first piece. But once you've kind of got your controls defined, you've got your process walkthroughs, the next piece for me is really starting to think about what are the artifacts that we can provide to support these controls, right? One of the main things that I feel like we see is, companies are doing a lot of controls, right? They're doing a monitoring control. They are doing a reconciliation. But when we as auditors come in and we say, well, how can you show me that you're doing this? They don't have anything to prove, right? They'll say, I'm monitoring this dashboard live, right? Well, that's excellent. And I'm sure that's probably a really strong control, but we can't prove that you're doing that, right? So when you're developing controls, also think about what can be provided to ultimately prove that you're doing these controls, right? So documentation is super key, really important. And again, as you're going through this, do them kind of hand in hand. Here's my control and here's what I could give, if I needed to support this. So once you've kind of defined those controls, you really want to do some sort of internal testing or readiness assessment. I would say, if you're only on this webcast for CPE, this is probably what I would think is the most important thing. If you're given the answers to the test, but you toss away, right, that answer sheet, you're not getting what you can out of the information put in front of you, right? Doing the prep work and doing the internal testing is going to be incredibly helpful when you get into the examination, right? So whether or not you're going to use a third-party firm to perform your readiness assessment or you're going to do it in-house, You know what's going to be on the test. You've designed the controls. You have them ready. You know what we're going to be looking for. So doing some internal testing and making sure that you have those controls and you have that documentation is really, really important. So again, it can be done in-house. It can be done using a third party. We do readiness assessments before 95% of our first examinations. I would strongly suggest that, just because having that firm that you're going to have do your examination, do the readiness, sets you up for success, because you do know exactly what they're going to be looking for. But either way, making sure you're going control by control, understanding what you have and what you don't have, and then evaluating any gaps. So you do want to make sure if you have any gap areas where you feel like you need to be a little stronger, or maybe controls aren't in place, or maybe we're not documenting something, making sure you're spending the time truly remediating those gaps before you jump into the examination is really important. And then the last item on this slide, also super key, is preparing staff for an examination, right? Making sure that everybody understands what it's going to take, who's going to be involved, and what's expected of them, right? So, talking through, here are the controls, you're responsible for. Do you have the evidence? Here's what they're going to ask you to pull. Here's the time commitment, so that they can kind of set that aside and be ready when the exam comes and not really be caught off guard. So I think that's really important as well. Just a few, tips on kind of the initial testing of the control. Again, conducting that readiness assessment, whether that's internal or done by a third party. But, during a readiness assessment and during any sort of kind of initial controls assessment, you're testing probably one, maybe two transactions, to make sure that the control is there, that it is designed, that it is implemented, but you're not necessarily testing what that would be like operating throughout the entire period. So one of the things you want to make sure when you're doing this initial testing is confirming that you can also pull populations. So this does become a bit of an issue sometimes, where we get in and, people can say, hey, I'm doing this for this transaction. We're reviewing these, these invoices. But when you ask them to pull a full population of, invoices from X date to X date, or rejected invoices, or whatever that is, they don't have a good way to pull that so that we feel comfortable that the listing is complete and accurate, right? SOC 1 is all about the completeness and accuracy of reports and controls and testing. And so making sure that you're able to pull a complete and accurate listing of anything we're going to test during an examination is also very important to consider during the readiness assessment phase. And I think the last piece here on the remediation and kind of ensuring continued operation, as I mentioned, we are only testing tests of one during a readiness, maybe two. It's a very small sample set. So educating, the team on, you've got to continuously perform the control in a consistent manner, right? You have to, every time you do that reconciliation, you have to date it, you have to flag it, you have to sign it, getting them to understand that this is a consistent, continued operation of controls, as opposed to, just doing it every so often and presenting the auditor with the best case scenario, right? You're not going to get the option to present the best case scenario, right? You're going to be asked to pull, certain transactions. And so making sure it's truly consistent, consistently performed is going to be really important during the remediation and the continued operation phase. So providing training and awareness, again, I mentioned this just a few slides ago, but truly making sure that employees involved in this process understand what their role is and understand what they're going to be asked. And so one of the things, I think is important is developing training that covers these processes, covers what the asks are going to be, covers, maybe things that aren't necessarily your responsibility, but you want to learn the entire business process, right? So kind of doing a training that really includes these process areas, as well as training people on what this is going to be like when they get started. Making sure that they understand there's going to be a couple phases when they get into the examination, right? They're going to be asked to walk through the processes that they perform, show the auditors what you do, talk through what you do with them, do observations of certain, screens that you're looking at on a daily basis. It's also going to be, pulling the documentation, pulling that set of invoices, pulling those approvals. And then ultimately, what I always like to remind clients of is that follow-up questions piece. Making sure they understand that there's going to be follow-up questions. That's how audits work. There's going to be things that we have questions on that maybe you haven't, completely delivered or any of that, but there's going to be several phases of that audit that they will need to be involved in. And then once you're ready, right? You've studied for the test, you've got everything prepared, you've got your notes in front of you, so you're ready to go. That's when we would kick off an examination, right? And, starting those examinations, it's super important to hold a planning meeting, right? Make sure everybody agrees up front. Here is the scope. This is the scope we agree to test. These are the systems we agree should be there. And this is the timeline we agree, to work through on this audit. So holding that at the very beginning, very important. Making sure that you are giving the auditor access to the documentation that they need. Also really important from the kickoff of the engagement. We talked through the walkthrough, the interview, the testing phase. All of that will occur obviously during this phase as well. And so, again, just making sure that you're prepped and ready for that. So the next piece here, tips of undergoing, the first SOC examination for the 10-month phase. All gaps have to be cleared before you kick off your examination. So we have to make sure that anything you identified during your internal audit testing, during your readiness assessment testing, that you are clearing those before you kick off an engagement. And again, just as a reminder, these engagements do have to be performed by a CPA firm, and it can't be done by yourself internally or internal audit. Those do need to be done by a licensed CPA firm. So that takes us to the next polling question, which is what stage is your organization at in its SOC 1 journey? So, how are you just starting? Is this your first step? You're learning a little bit about it. Are you preparing to undergo your readiness assessment? Have you completed the readiness assessment and you're about to, undergo the examination? Or do you have one already? If you're just on for CPE, pick whichever one feels right to you, but just want to see kind of where you all are from an examination standpoint.
Yeah, Karen, great information. You did get a couple of questions that came in. So one question was, what about a type or SOC 3, I guess, was the question here. And so from my perspective, right, SOC 3 is very much tied to a SOC 2. You really need to issue a SOC 2 examination to issue a SOC 3. And it is a more of a client or public-facing report, right? So you don't have all the details in that report. But Karen, any thoughts on SOC 3 reports?
Yeah, I mean, again, we generally see those in the SOC 2 world, and really, I think that's because, especially in tech firms, you don't necessarily want competitors to see your system description, right? The type 2 report is going to have your full system description in there, and so anyone who gets their hands on that will be able to see that. So a lot of times I do have, especially when it comes to startup tech companies, they are very closely guarded to their controls. And so they would get a SOC 3 so that they can still say, hey, our controls are clean. We've got this third party opinion, but they only give the SOC 2 type 2 to maybe a current client because they just don't want it out there. But that's generally the main use I see for it. Any
good
other
information.
questions that didn't get answered?
Yeah, I would say that the one question about bridge letters came up, and I think that's a good question, and maybe something to talk about here on the common pitfalls is if you're a user of a SOC report and that vendor gives you a bridge letter, but doesn't give you the report soon thereafter or the next year, that might be some red flags. But Karen, any thoughts about bridge letters or comfort letters around that?
Yeah, a couple things about that, and one of the things we get asked about the most is, twofold. One, the bridge letter comes directly from the client, right? It does not come from the CPA firm. We are not attesting to the section of controls that or the time frame that we didn't test. So the bridge letter does always come from the provider themselves, not the service auditor. And the other piece of that is, generally speaking, I say generally, this is not, specifically defined, but generally speaking, bridge letters are not accepted over the 90-day period. So if you're getting a bridge letter that's significantly longer than that, you probably want to question why that is. And sometimes there's a really good reason for that. But, a 90-day, 3-month bridge letter is completely fine. It's completely fine to have a 3-month gap as well. I just saw a comment come through for that. You can absolutely have that gap period, but you want to make sure that you don't have, a bridge letter really longer than 90 days.
Good information. We'll try to get to some more questions. We'll kind of wrap things up here in a minute, but we'll kind of go into common pitfalls, and we've talked about most of these already. I'd say my biggest challenge, I think, when I think about challenges our clients face, is that inadequate documentation. It's just one of those areas where, as Karen said, right, take advantage of preparing for the ultimate examination or that test by doing a readiness assessment, doing some good planning, defining the controls. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if that documentation doesn't come along with that process, right, and is not maintained, we do see that's really where clients struggle. And we have clients, right, that especially in COVID, where we had some exits, we had some turnover in teams where documentation wasn't maintained. And so it wasn't the control environments, the control owners intentionally wanted to, disregard the control. It was just that, that person left the company and that control wasn't maintained, and ultimately that resulted in a deviation. So Karen, any thoughts on the common pitfalls you see out there?
No, I think you covered some of the main ones. Sorry, I was responding to some Q&A questions in here, but I think those covered. The biggest one is definitely inadequate documentation. I would say every time I go into an assessment, that's the biggest one. They say, we're doing this. We absolutely do this, but they don't have anything to give me.
Yeah, and that's a great segue to this next slide, and it's probably the auditor's joke, right? If it's not documented, it didn't happen. And I'd say that's really where we would want to prepare your organization, your team, to not have this situation occur, is where the auditor comes in, expects the control to be documented, and there's no evidence there to support effectiveness or design of the control. And so it's better to know what the expectation is on the front end before you get into that examination. So just something to think about. Ultimately, guys, just wanted to kind of wrap things up before we let you go for the day. We do think there's a really important component of all this. Readiness assessment is really the first step. If you get that contract that says you need to have a SOC report, reach out to, Karen, myself, Forvis Mazars. We'd love to have a conversation with you guys about our experience in this space and ultimately what we believe is the next step forward. And ultimately, if you don't pursue a SOC report, it's a win for your organization because you can maybe delay that process. But if you have to go down that path because you're contractually obligated to do so, definitely don't go down that path alone. Work with the organization like Forvis Mazars. We have a dedicated national SOC and high trust practice designed to really dive into the details, help organizations go from ground zero to issuing that report and maintaining that report on an annual basis. So definitely here to support you in that discussion. Obviously, keep listing out some questions. If we don't get to them before we let you go, we'll definitely respond to them via email. And with that, we'll close it out with our last poll. And Karen, any other questions that you saw that we want to try to address?
Yes, you did get a question. It says, if your provider had a lapse that produced incorrect financial results during the period of time, would you expect that instance to show up as an incident? And if so, what would you look for in the SOC 1 report?
Yeah, if it truly was a material gap in the control environment or a situation that resulted in a deviation in material weakness in the control environment, we would expect the SOC report to disclose that. In situations where we do sample-based tests, we don't pick that sample for some reason. Typically, management has obligation to self-report that deviation in the report, so that there's not a discrepancy in the conclusion of the SOC report versus what the customer expects to see. So that's my 2 cents on that. Again, really appreciate your time today. Please reach out with any questions. We would love to have a conversation with you. Got our contact information here, so reach out at any point and we can have a sidebar. And if we didn't get to your question, we will definitely follow up with you at some point in the near future. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.